We're going to start with properties of mathematics. The first property of math that we're going to study is associative property. Now I'm going to give you examples, not the proof. So the associative property allows us to regroup. So for example, if I can get my pen to write, for example, let's look at 7 plus 5 grouped together plus 5, and that equals 7 plus, and now we're going to group 5 plus 5. 7 plus 5 is 12, and if we add 5 to that, we get 17. And that is the same as 7 plus 10, which is 17. And that shows us that the 17, that we get the same thing on both sides. Okay, this is an example, not a proof. Now, I want you to notice that when we do the notes at the top of each page, I will write example, EX equals example. And whenever you see something like that at the top of the page of the notes, that will mean that's a new abbreviation. Okay? Next, the associative property of multiplication. For example, 4 times 6 times 5 equals 4 times 6 times 5. This again allows us to regroup. It makes multiplication easier. So on the left side we have 24 times 5, which for me it's easier to set that up vertically, so that's 24 times 5, which is 20, which is 120. So this side is equal to 120, whereas if we regroup that, we get that the parentheses is 30 times 4. Well, we know 4 times 3 is 12, so that's 120. So we have, again, both sides are equal. For me, the right side is easier to work. Okay, so that's easier. So that's what the associative property allows us to do, is to regroup so we can set things up that are easier. The second property that we're going to discuss is commutative property. Commutative is like saying that the equal sign is a mirror. So we have 2 plus 3 equals 3 plus 2. So that says 5 equals 5. So again, it's a way to show things are equal, but we treat this equal sign as though it were a mirror, so we see the same thing on both sides. And for multiplication, that's 3 times 2 is 6 equals 2 times 3 is 6. And this is a good way for students to say that we can go students often ask me, well, can't I just do this as can I just do 2 times 3 or 3 times 2? And the answer is yes, because they are the same by the commutative property. So now let's move on to the next page. And the next page we have, for the next one, we have the distributive property. The distributive property of math, if we go this direction, we have distributive property, whereas if we go this direction, we have factoring. This is one of the most used and misused properties of mathematics. Most people forget to distribute, and what they do is they multiply this A times just the first letter. And that would be saying that the first person in the alphabet gets 5 points, but not everybody else. And that is commonly where it's misused. Where it's used in mathematics. It is often forgotten and forgotten in math, where it is forgotten to be used in math is where it's pulling out the greatest common factor. And most people forget that you pull out the greatest common factor, and that's actually using the distributive property, is going this direction. The next thing that we're going to talk about, you also have the identity, and I want you to notice that the identity property and the addition zero property are the same thing. Sometimes you have one and not the other. Very often that's the case. Very seldom do you have both. I'm giving you both just so that in your future you realize that it could be called one or the other. I will not refer to either. Usually, I guess I'm more likely to call it the identity as zero than I am to call the addition property of zero. I'm more likely to call it the identity as zero because that's what I think of it as, whereas the identity of multiplication is 1 because it's whatever makes it A, whatever keeps it the same as A. But you do need to realize that the multiplication property of 0 is 0, but the addition property of 0 is that it keeps it the same. But those two are the same in the list that I have, just because in looking up the research I did to prepare for this, I found it called both things. The next little thing I'm going to talk about is equations, and the one thing that you need to know is that what you do to one side, you must do to the other. You must keep everything balanced. Okay? And that's the big thing about the equality. You have the addition property, the subtraction property, the multiplication property, and the division property. The next thing we're going to talk about are the 3 things for proofs. These are mostly used in geometry, is where you will see them most, or in 4370 in your curriculum. And that's reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. I have then given you a table of all the properties. I did not list the 0 property for addition because, again, I listed it under identity because that's what we call it. All right, let's get on to the examples. That's where it's important. All right, so let's talk about our first example. So let's call A being the corner of the paper, and B the corner of the room. Then C is 90 degrees. All right? I know that A equals B because they're both corners. Okay? I know that B equals C. This is because they're both 90 degrees. This is because they're both 90 degrees. Then, and this symbol right here mathematically means then. Bitransitive, I know that A equals C. I also know it because the corner of the paper is also 90 degrees. It doesn't have to be logically true if I know it by a proof. But this is also logically true. All right. The commutative property is like a mirror, remember? So my answer here is D. I know that 5 times 6 equals 6 times 5 because of commutative property. And PROP is going to be my property definition. I am really big on abbreviations. When I was in 7th grade, I had a biology teacher that was really big on abbreviations, so I became really big on abbreviations. The next property is the addition property or the additive property for equality. Okay, and that is when we add one thing to one side, add C to one side, we must add it to the other. Okay, identity property that says adding 0 to any number leaves it unchanged, and that is the addition identity. Okay, and for the last one, another way to write this would be A plus 0 equals 0 plus A equals 0. And this is a way to add it using the commutative property. And that's a way that that mathematicians see it, or you will see it in a higher math book. All right. Identify the property that states if you subtract a number from both sides of the equation is still true. This would be the subtraction property. Subtraction. And I cannot spell. Subtraction property for equality. Okay. And for the last one, we would have that this equals 6 plus 4 plus 5. And that, what I just did, is using commutative property. And that equals parentheses 6 plus 4 plus 5, and that's associative. And that gives me 10 plus 5, and that's 15. And that would, the last two would be I just added. And for this one, I would do 8 plus 3 plus 7. Excuse me. And that would be commutative. And that would be associative. And that would be 8 plus 10, which is 18. And the last two would be addition. All right. And that concludes the Properties of Math video. Please email me if you have any questions.